about Asia. We had the crisis in 97-98. Following the crisis in 97-98, where currencies collapsed and stock markets collapsed, and the banks essentially were in a very bad shape, and they had to be recapitalized, and there was a process after 97-98 of deleveraging. In other words, the banks were very cautious with their lending, and Asian bankers, by and large, were too stupid to understand CDOs and structured products, so they never touched them. So we have actually, at the present time, the soundest banks in the world are in Asia. If you're worried about your money in a Citigroup or UBS, you should have your account with an Asian bank, say a Singapore bank. They're 100% safe. Also Thai banks, if you have a Thai deposit in a Thai bank, your risk is the currency. But it's not a default risk by the bank today because they recapitalized and they were very cautious in their lending practices after 98. Now China, as you know, grew very rapidly in the last couple of years and was already a large economy in 2001, and as a result of that they became, say, the number one or number two user of raw materials, and that will not go away. They will continue to buy because they don't have copper, they don't have iron ore, they have very little crude oil relative to the population, so that demand will not vanish, boom, in the air. Now, I concede that maybe in a year the demand for copper or for iron ore or for oil may not go up. Maybe there's even inventory liquidation and it could go down for 1 year. But the long-term trend for all commodities, for the demand of all commodities out of China will be up, because you can see that whereas in America, say this is per capita consumption of oil in the United States, 27 barrels per annum. Per capita consumption of oil in Japan, Korea, 17 barrels per capita. In China, it's just here 1.8 barrels, and India with 1 billion people, 0.8 barrels. And so the demand out of China and India will keep on rising, in my opinion. Now, it can slow down from time to time, or even it can have a brief blip down. But long-term trend, I think, will be up, and I think that the Asian demand for oil, which is now 22 million barrels daily, on 3.6 billion people, whereas America has also 22 million barrels oil demand daily, but only on 300 million people, that this will essentially double in future in the next 12, 15 years. And so I doubt that the oil supplies will be sufficient in future to meet the demand. Now, the demand in the industrialized countries of the West and in the US has collapsed. Obviously, if oil prices soar and gasoline prices go up substantially, people will think 3 times about driving around the block to pick up something or to go eating outside and so forth. So the demand has been reduced here, and that has an impact on prices. I think the oil price could easily drop somewhat more. But in the very long run, I would imagine that actually oil prices will be substantially higher than they are at the present. And obviously in your lifetime, you will not see $10 or $12 a barrel oil ever again. For that, we have also Mr. Bernanke with his money printing press. Now, the reason I'm touching on oil is, and that can also in the future have an impact on asset markets, the increased geopolitical tensions. In the 1970s, the United States only imported 23% of its oil requirements. That's when the last oil crisis took place. Now they import 71% of their oil requirement. In China, you have here the oil reserves going down, the oil production is flat, the oil demand is up. After 1994, China became an oil importer, and China desperately needs oil for its economic growth, by the way, also India, for its industrial production, for its consumption. It's now the second largest consumer of oil in the world after the United States, second largest car market, by the way, also. And so the Chinese are not here because of the landscape, and the US are certainly not here because of human rights. That I assure you. And that leads to rising tensions because China needs oil, and the US also needs oil, both. The only difference between the US and China is that whereas the US can source its oil from Canada, from Mexico, Venezuela, from West Africa, and from the Middle East, Asia is almost entirely dependent on oil from the Middle East. 95% of oil comes to Asia along the sea lanes here through the Strait of Malacca, then up the Vietnamese coast, past the southern Chinese coast, past the southern tip of Taiwan, into the northern ports of China, Korea, and also Japan. And so the Chinese are very concerned about this because there is a strategic alliance between Taiwan, between the Japanese and the US to protect the status quo of Taiwan. And that has obviously led China, the foreign policies of Mr. Bush and Ms. Rice were not very successful, as you well know. But they have achieved one objective, and that is to unite the Chinese with the Russians. The Chinese and the Russians formed the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that essentially includes the Central Asian republics, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and also Uzbekistan, and the observing members are Iran, India, Pakistan, and Mongolia. If the observing members join, the organization would have close to 50% of the world's population. And you can imagine, the US wouldn't be enthused if the Chinese and the Russians had bases in Mexico and in Canada. And so the Chinese and the Russians, of course, they have zero interest that the US will succeed here in the Middle East. Zero interest. And they will not attack the US, but they will undertake anything they can to essentially bother the US in this region, in particular in Afghanistan and in the rest of the region. And if the US decides to attack Iran, I can assure you that there will be a very strong reaction from Russia and from China. So the geopolitical tensions are rising, and I would say eventually when war breaks out, I don't know whether World War III is already here, World War III will not be a war with a division of tanks here facing a division of tanks and shooting at each other, or a trench war. It will be a war that is very devious, where cities are attacked with biological weapons, or with weapons that switch off the electricity, or weapons that create natural disasters or whatnot. So we don't know whether we are already in war times, but during war times I can assure you of one thing. The entire derivatives market will be finished to zero. Number two, if you own commodities, you should not own them in derivatives or at UBS or Citigroup. You should own them physically. And during war times, commodities go ballistic, like here, Napoleonic Wars, American Civil War, World War I, Vietnam War. And I think, as a hedge, and I'm not saying you should put all your money into physical gold and physical uranium and oil and so forth. It's difficult to store a ton of uranium in your wife's kitchen. But basically, you should own some physical commodities as an insurance policy, because the central bankers will not insure you anymore. They cannot, they have no money. And the treasury departments will all have large deficits, and so paper money will not be good enough. You will have to have physical commodities, and if you own, say, some gold, you should actually mentally hope that it goes down.